Hello and welcome to China Now with me, Makiza Micheline Latifa. Let's begin the show with China Currents, where we bring you the top stories making headlines across China this week. So China has announced a ban on the export of military-related goods to Japan as tensions between the two sides continue to intensify. Meanwhile, a four-part anti-corruption documentary has begun airing on prime time on national television, drawing wide public attention to China's ongoing campaign for clean governance. And in the fast-growing space sector, China has submitted applications for more than 200,000 new satellites, highlighting its ambitious plan for future communications and technology development. These stories and many more are coming up shortly here on China Now. Stay with us.
Welcome to China Currents. In this episode, China bans exports of military-related goods. Netizens say Japan is teetering on the edge of deindustrialization. China airs a four-part anti-corruption documentary during prime time, revealing officials' collusion with business executives. An AI helps detect the king of cancers that doctors often overlook. China applies for over 200,000 new satellites, competing with SpaceX for low-orbit resources. China's top table tennis champion helps the German club win the championship. Now let's start today's China Currents. Following Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's reckless remarks that links the so-called Taiwan contingency with Japan's survival-threatening situation, China escalated its response. It has now banned the export of goods in both commercial and military applications to forestall their use by Japanese military. The ban covers over 1,000 items listed across more than 100 pages, with the media estimating their total value at 10.7 trillion yen, roughly 42% of Japan's total imports from China in 2024, which are expected to reach 25.3 trillion yen. Following this announcement, Nikkei 225 futures fell about 1%. Inside Japan, the tensions focused particularly on rare earths. Japanese research institutes estimate that if China's rare earth export restrictions last 3 months, losses would reach around 660 billion yen, reducing nominal and real GDP by 0.11%. If the ban lasts 1 year, losses could total 2.6 trillion yen, cutting annual nominal and real GDP by 0.43%. China's actions come at a time when Prime Minister Takaichi appears bent on reviving Japanese militarism. At her New Year press conference, she highlighted cooperation among China, Russia, and North Korea, laying a groundwork for Japan to adopt a more proactive and tougher stance in military and diplomatic matters. And domestically, the documentary airing on China Central Television has drawn significant attention due to its sensitive subject matter. Starting January 11th, every night at 8 p.m. prime time, China's state media has been broadcasting a 4-episode anti-corruption series entitled No Step Back, No Pause. The series underscored the seriousness with which China combats corruption, reflected in both the level of detail disclosed and the rank of officials featured in the documentary. In the first episode, Tang Renjian, former Minister of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, admitted on camera his illegal dealings with business people. He described how, due to his interest in antiques, local antique dealers befriended him by gifting collectibles and arranging private gatherings in high-end apartments and villas. Tang then endorsed some counterfeit antiques, allowing them to be sold at high prices to other customers, thereby generating substantial profits. Tang also reportedly used his position to grant favors to hotel developers in exchange for their creation of exclusive leisure spaces for him. While on duty locally, he would take accompanying officials to these private venues under the pretext of inspection or research, enjoying entertainment and dining. Since 2011, Tang's birthdays were celebrated lavishly by various business owners across tourist resorts in China. On one occasion, an entire hotel was cleared for him and his guests to stay for 3 days, enjoying scenic views, food, and games. The documentary is now airing in China, with further revelation of corruption, a symptom symbiotically linked to rapid development, which China has vowed to eradicate. Next, the New York Times featured a breakthrough in China, where AI helped detect pancreatic cancer, often called the king of cancers. In a story, a 57-year-old retired bricklayer, Mr. Chu, received a call from the oncologist after a routine diabetes check. AI had detected signs of pancreatic cancer in his standard CT scan. Fortunately, it was caught early and surgery successfully removed the tumor. Pancreatic cancer is recognized as one of the most lethal because its early symptoms are similar to those of common gastrointestinal disorders. Over 80% of patients are diagnosed late, and a global 5-year survival rate is just 10%. The AI-assisted case is striking because it flagged cancer from a regular, inexpensive CT scan, suggesting that widespread use of the AI could greatly improve early detection. The AI model Damo Panda was developed by Alibaba's research institute Damo Academy. Chinese scientists have worked on it for over a decade. Since November 2014, the AI model analyzed over 180,000 CT scans at Ningbo University-affiliated People's Hospital, helping doctors identify 24 cases of pancreatic cancer, 14 of which were early stage. Dr. Zhu Kelei at the hospital said, "I can say with 100% certainty that AI saved their lives. These patients came in for bloating or nausea, not pancreatic screening, and their CTs appeared normal until AI flagged them." Senior algorithm expert Zhang Ling from Damo Academy described in Nature Medicine that Panda correctly identified 93% of pancreatic cancer cases in over 20,000 routine CT tests. In April last year, the US FDA granted Panda breakthrough medical device status, expediting review for patient access. Meanwhile, the Chinese team using Panda is working to improve accuracy and minimize stress from false positives. Next, let's look at China-US competition in space. According to the International Telecommunication Union, China submitted applications for over 200,000 low Earth orbit satellites in December 2025. Experts from leading commercial satellite companies told reporters that these applications signal a national strategic priority. The Institute of Radio Spectrum Utilization and Technology Innovation, China's newly formed team dedicated to these enterprises, can integrate industry resources and leverage China's massive market to catch up with SpaceX. By regulation, applicants must deploy 10% of their satellites within 7 years, and 50% within 9 years, and 100% within 14 years to retain rights. Industry analysts view this as a countermeasure to SpaceX Starlink, since low Earth orbit resources are limited. SpaceX has already applied for 42,000 satellites, with 10,000 currently in orbit. Other countries, including Rwanda and France, have also submitted large-scale applications. This competition for resources is driven not only by their scarcity, but also by the fact that SpaceX's low Earth orbit satellites are affecting other facilities in low Earth orbit. In the past, China had raised objections to the US when Musk's satellites approached China's Tiangong space station, requesting stricter regulation, though with limited success. The recent applications for over 200,000 satellites are widely seen as a reluctant effort to counterbalance the US aggressive deployment. Now let's turn to a story that's a little less tense: Chinese table tennis excellence. On January 5, 2026, 5,200 spectators in Germany witnessed history. Olympic champion and Chinese table tennis star Fan Zhendong led the Saarbrücken club to a 3-1 victory over Fudan, claiming the German Cup championship. This was Fan's first overseas championship since joining the German Bundesliga in June 2025 and marks a new professional path for Chinese athletes abroad. Even with his dominance and skill, the tournament proved grueling. Semi-finals and finals were held on the same day, requiring athletes to play multiple high-intensity matches within hours, testing both stamina and mental resilience. Fan Zhendong played 4 matches in a single day, winning them all. In the semi-finals, he almost single-handedly carried his team to the finals. In the final, he came from 5-8 down in the second game to score 6 consecutive points, securing a straight-set victory over a veteran German opponent. After winning both men's singles and team gold at the 2024 Paris Olympics, Fan left the national team and world ranking system, breaking from the conventional career path of Chinese top players. The victory also brought commercial success. Ticket sales for Saarbrücken home games sold out in 3 minutes, attracting 5,200 spectators, a Bundesliga attendance record. Club sponsorship jumped from 10 to 64, and co-branded jerseys with fans sold out within just 2 hours, increasing sales 16-fold. Fan said in an interview, "I'm very happy to come to Germany and compete against top teams. I can feel the passion for table tennis and respect for players everywhere I go." And that's it for today. See you next time.
And up next is Top Picks, where we highlight key global perspectives on today's most pressing geopolitical issues. Our featured commentator is Peter Young, a geopolitics and foreign policy analyst who examines how China uses military drills as a strategic tool to deter separatist movements in Taiwan.
Last year, on December 29th, China has launched the Justice Mission 2025, which is a 3-day large-scale military exercise that encircled the island of Taiwan. It was the 6th such operation since Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island in 2022. The element of surprise was striking. Without warning, more than 130 aircraft and drones, alongside roughly 25 warships and naval vessels, enveloped Taiwan and its offshore territories. The Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA, its multi-rocket launcher units and missile forces carry out precision strike simulations, firing more than 27 missiles and rockets. And within 2 hours after the exercise began, a PLA drone flew over Taiwan's airspace and filmed its iconic Taipei 101 tower. Taiwan's response was disorganized at the best. Its visible confusion in the military posture suggests the operation caught this island by surprise. The timing also matters. This drill took place in December last year, outside the usual April to May or September to October time windows that were generally regarded by these military analysts as the most plausible periods for major military operations in the Taiwan Strait. Now the PLA has been demonstrating the capacity and confidence to run such missions across all seasons. So the next drill could just occur at any time throughout the year. For Taiwan, this is not a symbolic shift. Its weapon deployments, troop rotations, and readiness cycles will now need to account for additional windows of potential crisis. That expansion raises both complexity and the cost. The exercise has involved 5 operational zones, and for the first time, 3 zones cover actually waters within 12 nautical miles of Taiwan. The PLA warships did not just formally cross a line, but the geometry of such operation was tight enough to essentially constrict Taiwan's airspace, leaving only 3 civilian air corridors open, and to place major ports under surveillance. On the second day, China's Maritime Safety Administration announced 2 more exercise zones, allowing the drill to cover nearly the entire Taiwan Strait. The signal here was deliberate. Taiwan officials have treated its 12 nautical mile line as a threshold, which would constitute an incursion, and they would, in response, authorize the military resistance if they cross. But by stopping just short, Beijing has preserved its escalation margin for the future incremental steps. And this strategy is called salami slicing. As a spokesperson from the People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command stated, this joint mission aimed to deter Taiwan separatist forces and external interference. So if Taiwan continues on its independence path, next time the PLA might just cross the threshold. So by the time, Taiwan would just face a dilemma. They either bear the risk of firing the first shot or accept the de facto erosion of its territorial waters. None of these are actually surprising. Since last November, tensions have risen sharply after the Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi stated that Japan will exercise its self-defense right if China imposes a blockade on Taiwan. Soon after that, the United States announced a record arms sales of over $11 billion to the island. That sale package has included over 80 HIMARS multi-rocket launcher systems, granting Taiwan a capacity to strike deep into mainland China. So the Justice Mission 2025 is dedicated to counter such activities with precision. 2 northern operational zones were positioned to cover Taipei while deterring Japanese involvement from Okinawa. An eastern operational zone focused on Hualien County of Taiwan, where a Chinese Navy's Type 075 amphibious assault ship had conducted the landing drills. Hualien, which situated on Taiwan's east coast and only little more than 100 kilometers from Japan's Yonaguni Island, has long been viewed as a rare sanctuary where Taiwan's military could just reorganize and resupply with external support. Now, this exercise was meant to invalidate such assumption. Meanwhile, 3,000 operational zones were also established to deter US forces in the Philippines. On a naval blockade, as an island with limited reserves, only around 90 days of oil, 11 days of LNG, the liquefied natural gas, and 30 to 40 days of coal, Taiwan cannot withstand a serious blockade without external intervention. Regarding HIMARS, the Chinese Army also deployed the countermeasures. Its PHL-16 multi-rocket launcher systems has simulated strikes against HIMARS. China has also demonstrated the precision strike capacities at ranges up to 300 kilometers, implying its capacity to virtually hit any location on Taiwan. HIMARS, which stands for High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, is designed around rapid maneuver. It works best across expansive terrain, as in Ukraine or Iraq, where mobility means survivability. But Taiwan's mountainous region sharply constrains such mobility. By rehearsing precision strikes across the island, Beijing is able to perpetually displace HIMARS, forcing its constant relocation and narrowing its firing windows and degrading its effectiveness. And more than that, HIMARS alone cannot break a naval blockade. It must be integrated with naval mines, coastal radar, and air defenses. And obviously, these items are not included in the US sales package. Instead, the deal includes $10 billion for the Tactical Mission Network software, a software. Then there's like 91 million in support services for the missiles, instead of like actual missiles. $96 million in helicopter repair services, the repair services. And $330 million in spare parts for the F-16s and other aircrafts. Given the pace of prior US deliveries, such as the severe delay of F-16 Viper fighters ordered in 2019 and still haven't delivered today, these purchased items may not arrive for years to come. All of this points to the harsh truth that the USA is not arming Taiwan, it is milking Taiwan. The US messaging on Taiwan has long been defined by contradictions. During the first Trump's term, he described Taiwan as a Sharpie pen while comparing China as a desk table, suggesting the island was too small to defend. Then under the Biden administration, Admiral Philip Davidson, then commander of the US Indo-Pacific Command, warned that China could launch an attack by 2027, and that is called like the Davidson window. After Trump 2, the narrative shifted again, this time accusing Taiwan of spending too little on defense. The Elbridge Corby, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, demanded that Taiwan will raise its defense spending beyond 5% of GDP, and even suggesting over 10%. Taking a deeper look, these lines are contradictory in form, but, well, actually consistent in function. They cultivate the fear of a Chinese takeover, the threat of US abandonment, the prospect of ongoing war, and the public denouncing. They all operate as instruments of political psychology for the Washington. It manufactures this existential anxiety and sustains the demand for US weapons, regardless of their actual usefulness. Over time, the external support for Taiwan may begin to resemble the logic of Ukraine, which is a rising bill attached to an uncertain outcome. The incentive to provide cutting-edge weapons diminish because most of these weapons would merely delay instead of actually prevent China's eventual takeover of the island. The economic logic then points towards selling arms that are increasingly useless but overpriced at the same time. If Taiwan cannot be saved, the temptation for the United States becomes to extract the profit while the opportunity remains. So it becomes a long game where China gains strategically while Washington profits financially. There is only one losing side, and that is the island of Taiwan. This leads to our next question. Under such conditions, why do Taiwan's authorities continue to trust America's assurance and tell its own population that the United States and the so-called free world will save them? To answer that, let's examine the history. Chinese administrative control over Taiwan can be traced back to the Song Dynasty in the 12th century. That was like over 800 years ago, and 600 years before the United States was ever born. In the 17th century, China's Ming Dynasty general called Zheng Chenggong, the guy also known in the West as the Koxinga, expelled the Dutch colonists and restored Chinese rule on Taiwan. In 1683, the Qing dynasty of China formally incorporated Taiwan and governed it for more than 2 centuries until 1895, when China ceded Taiwan to Japan after its defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War. Taiwan then remained under the Japanese colonial rule until the end of World War II. After Japan's defeat, Taiwan was returned to China in 1945 under the Cairo Declaration. By 1948, the Republic of China, the ROC, stated that Taiwan was Chinese territory in its constitution. After losing the civil war to People's Republic of China, the PRC, which is China as we know today, the ROC retreated to Taiwan. But it continued to claim that it represents all of China, both mainland and Taiwan. Until 1971, it held China's seat at the United Nations, including a seat on the Security Council. Contested representations at the UN like this was not unique to China. The Cold War divisions in Germany, in Korea, and Vietnam all followed similar patterns. But what made the Chinese case distinctive was the international taking of this one China principle. Even in defeat, the Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the ROC and the Nationalist Party, or called the KMT, they refused to accept any division of China. And that is a position which Beijing also shared. The implication was profound. Recognizing one China means severing diplomatic relations with the other side. So, America's one China policy echoed this logic, and the United States formally acknowledged that there is only one China. This framework shaped the US politics in the 1950s. The then Senator Joseph McCarthy used the pretext of "who lost China," referring to the ROC's defeat on the mainland to attack the US State Department. The ROC sympathizers in the United States also built a China lobby to block the US contact with the mainland. As a result, for 3 decades after the People's Republic of China, the PRC, established formal rule in Beijing, Washington continued to recognize Taipei as China and avoided the official relations with Beijing. Yet, even while maintaining those formal commitments, the United States quietly helped lay the foundations for Taiwan independence mindsets. That's a tragedy in making. The US has manufactured a Taiwan card for its own leverage. In 1950, the United States 7th Fleet deployed into the Taiwan Strait to prevent either side from attacking the other. It practically prevented China's unification and institutionalized this de facto separation as we see today. In 1952, Washington has pressed the ROC on Taiwan to sign a peace treaty with Japan, where Japan announced its sovereignty will be handed over to Taiwan, but did not specify to whom sovereignty was transferred. This has introduced the notion that Taiwan's legal status was undetermined. That formulation conflicted with the spirit of the Potsdam Declaration and later became a legal foundation for Taiwan independence movements. Again, it's a tragedy. Throughout the Cold War, Washington has encouraged the separation on the two sides. It repeatedly suggested that the ROC to cut remaining ties with the mainland. But in the 1970s, Washington re-engaged mainland China, the PRC, as part of his Cold War strategy against Soviet Union, and switched the diplomatic recognition to Beijing in 1979. But even after the normalization of the status, Washington still established its strategic ambiguity through the Taiwan Relations Act, avoiding a clear defense commitment while maintaining a legal channel for arms sales to Taiwan. The underlying objective remained the status quo separation of China, both mainland and Taiwan. That's the Americans' tricks. By 1980s, such action has facilitated the rise of the Taiwan's pro-independence party called Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, as we know today. So its party charter actually dreams about the creation of a Taiwan state. Facing this challenge, Taiwan's ruling party at the time, the KMT, the Nationalist Party, actually reached an understanding with mainland China in 1992, known as the 1992 Consensus, or called the 92 Consensus. Both sides has acknowledged that there is only one China. So this created a brief period of détente between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. However, when the DPP came to power in the early 2000s under Chen Shui-bian, tensions rose again. The guy pursued the constitutional referendum to undermine relations with mainland China, and even sought the UN membership under the name Taiwan. These moves has polarized the Taiwan society, has degraded Taiwan's democratic system into a spectacle of sectarian politics and patronage-driven corruption. They've also placed the United States in a very dangerous situation because even back in the early 2000s, Washington couldn't afford war with China over Taiwan while also fighting in the Middle East. So that's why back in 2003, Bush Jr. has rebuked Taiwan, stating that the US government opposed any unilateral decision by either sides of Taiwan Strait to change the status quo. And the comments and actions made by the leader of Taiwan indicates that he may be willing to make decisions unilaterally to change the status quo, which we oppose. That's the Americans' official standing back then. That intervention was sufficient enough to undermine the DPP's position in the 2004 election. Chen was widely expected to lose such election. Until then, he was suddenly shot on the eve of voting and then narrowly won the margin. The shooter's motive remains unknown to this day, given his suicide 10 days after the shooting was quite strange. That incident actually generated some of the public sympathy for Chen, allowing the guy to win by fewer than 30,000 votes. But the episode has actually plunged Taiwan into further instability. The KMT, the Nationalist Party, has contested that the result and accused Chen of staging such incident. Now we fast forward to 2008. The Ma Ying-jeou, the KMT candidate, came to power and reaffirmed the 1992 consensus. From 2008 to 2016, the cross-strait relations has been stabilized. Trade expanded and cultural exchanges has reached unprecedented levels. Economic integration also deepened. And in year 2015, Ma Ying-jeou and President Xi of China has actually met in a historical summit in Singapore. However, this golden era began to unravel in the 2010s as China's rise has increasingly challenged the US hegemony. The United States has once again started to play its Taiwan card, except its old strategy of maintaining a cross-strait military balance through arms sales was no longer effective, because China's growing military capacity, especially in the anti-access and area denial, has undermined the credibility of a US military intervention in the Taiwan Strait. So Washington faced a dilemma. Committing to Taiwan's defense will violate its One China policy and damage the US credibility. But allowing China to take over Taiwan will also weaken the US credibility. So that's why instead, Washington has adopted a third route to make Taiwan a so-called porcupine, hard for China to swallow. Its approach was to aggressively promote the Taiwan identity. Back in 2014, when Ma Ying-jeou, the leader of Taiwan, has successfully negotiated a peace deal and trade agreement with the mainland China, suddenly a student protest known as the Sunflower Movement has erupted and occupied Taiwan's legislative house. It has blocked the deal, and then the DPP soon came to power with US backing. They conducted the systematic efforts to distinguish Taiwan from the mainland across culture, across politics, and identity. The 1992 consensus was repudiated by the DPP government. Its confusing claim was that Taiwan does not belong to China because the notion of mutual non-subordination between the ROC and the PRC, so between the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. Well, I think that's quite weird enough, I have to say. The DPP also utilized the ideologies from both far left to far right to serve its own agenda. So that's why the same-sex marriage was legalized. It was the first such legislation in Asia. Then the anti-communism sentiment was also revived to reframe the Chinese Civil War as a struggle against the Chinese Communist Party. Then even the World War II history was rewritten to portray Taiwan as fighting alongside the Japanese Empire. What a distortion, I have to say. By desyncretizing Taiwan, China's cost of governance would rise. So if a majority of the population genuinely believe in a distinct national identity, it could be mobilized to fight, enhancing the deterrence by making China harder to take the island. I mean, that's their logic, that's their strategy. The United States also began interfering directly in Taiwan's defense. Instead of relying on expensive platforms that could be destroyed by China quickly, the focus shifted toward like attritional warfare. And the US was arming Taiwanese people to fight until the last one bled dry. This explains why the recent US arms sales included like more than 1,000 Javelin missiles and drones, just like what they did in Ukraine. So I beg and I hope people in Taiwan watch out the Americans. But in essence, Washington is actually destroying its own Taiwan card, because the mobilization objective rests on a core assumption that mainland China could be defeated in a real conflict. This assumption helps explain why Joe Biden stated over 4 times between 2021 and 2022 that the USA will defend Taiwan. There were like different justifications: democracy, semiconductors, even the claim that Taiwan is the last stand of the American position in the Indo-Pacific. Many even argue that even without direct US intervention, a military takeover from the mainland would be costly and unlikely, because the difficulty of the amphibious operations against Taiwan and its 200,000 strong standing army. But in reality, these narratives fracture under scrutiny. First of all, history never supported that the claim the USA would defend Taiwan for democracy. Washington has committed to Taiwan's defense between 1950s and 1980s under the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty, even as the ROC has suspended elections and ruled under martial law. The USA also defended Kuwait, which is a monarchy, in 1991. While in 2008 and 2022, when Russian army drove into Georgia and Ukraine, they were like both Western-style democracies, the US military did not come to their rescue. Then there was the semiconductor argument. It is actually even more disingenuous. Western media often depicts Taiwan's chip industry, which produces over 90% of the advanced chips in the world, largely through a company called TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, as a silicon shield which guarantees the US protection. And business tycoons have amplified this narrative. For instance, the guy called Jensen Huang, which is a Taiwanese American and CEO of NVIDIA. He had toured the island and reassured his public about the significance of this island. But behind the scenes, the USA has been hollowing out Taiwan's semiconductor leverage. On August 9, 2022, only days after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, Biden has signed the CHIPS Act, providing $6.6 billion in subsidies and $5 billion in loans to build the TSMC fabs, the semiconductor manufacturing plants in Arizona, the US homeland. In December 2022, the TSMC has announced that it would triple its investment to $40 billion. By 2025, $165 billion in the investment was pledged. This has effectively boosted the US semiconductor self-sufficiency using Taiwanese technology and Taiwanese capital. While encouraging Taiwan to confront mainland China, Washington has already laid the foundation for its own future withdrawal. Now, the most extreme claim is that defeating China in the Taiwan Strait would secure the American hegemony. Geography suggests otherwise, because Taiwan is probably the worst place for the US to fight for its 21st century dominance. China's missiles, aircrafts, and artillery enjoy strategic depth and logistical advantage, while the US bases along the first and second island chain are distant from the American homeland and are exposed to the PLA's massive firepower. Back in World War II, the United States won the Pacific War by destroying an overstretched Japanese fleet in a battle such as Midway by relying on the logistical advantages. By contrast, America's defeat at the Chosin Reservoir in 1951 during the Korean War was also driven by its logistical overreach. And that is why any war game on Taiwan with a US coalition victory should be treated with fuss. These simulations assume that China's forces would be defeated after losing control of air and sea, forcing Beijing to escalate the nuclear option or to withdraw and avoid the domestic instability. That assumption effectively treats China as like Argentina in the Falklands War, which was a minor power seeking destruction from internal breakdown. But here with China, Once the US military enters the Taiwan Strait, it becomes an existential war for every Chinese, comparable to the Korean War where Chinese army has shed the blood and drove out the American forces. China could suffer economically. There may be tactical and operational drawbacks, but the war would not end until China seized the island and secured the objective. So betting victory on a Chinese decision to retreat after losses is both unconvincing and irresponsible. As China's military power grows, it will not just shatter the Taiwan independence movements to fantasy, it will also erode Taiwan's confidence in maintaining the status quo. If that sentiment takes root, a powerful impulse toward accommodation with mainland China will emerge, and America's Taiwan card will crumble from within Taiwan itself. And ironically, the DPP leadership in Taipei is mostly aware of this trajectory. So that's the reason why in recent years, he has made efforts to cultivating such an unquestioning belief, it's like almost cult-like faith in America's willingness to defend Taiwan. The campaigns have sought to purge like American skeptics within the island, because the logic for them is quite simple. If the idea that Taiwan independence is impossible, if that idea circles around and the US withdrawal follows the suit, then the DPP will be condemned as one of the biggest liars in history and been pushed into irrelevance or distinction. Washington may already be expecting such outcome, especially as the US-China relations improve and stabilize. China is now treated by the US as a fellow great power, so raising the prospect of a grand bargain over Taiwan. Since Trump's return to office, China has sought clarity. For decades, the USA has been stating that it does not support Taiwan independence. But Beijing wants Washington to go one step further, to oppose the Taiwan independence. Even without Trump, the pressure toward accommodation still persists, because Taiwan separatism is increasingly viewed as a central threat to global stability, especially across the global south. More than 70 countries have issued statements supporting China's right to resolve the Taiwan issue by any means, including by force. So the clock is ticking. If China and the USA fail to reach consensus quickly, a more radical force might emerge. As the window closes, the radical extremists will argue that the DPP leadership is too cautious and must push for formal independence right now, before a great power exchange locks in the Taiwan's fate. If the DPP is consumed by such monstrous force it created itself, neither Washington's statements nor China's military drills will be sufficient to defuse the situation peacefully. That may explain why in 2024 alone, more than 400 Taiwanese high net worth individuals had left the island. We have seen this pattern before. The US-backed Syrian rebels were replaced by ISIS, putting the United States into a broader war. The US backing of Ukraine against Russia has resulted in a choice between nuclear escalation and humiliating defeat. If Taiwan follows the same trajectory, the balance across the Taiwan Strait will collapse, not because of any military drill by China, but because of decades of contradictions has finally reached their breaking point. Thanks for watching. This is Curtis at Sinopolitik. See you next time.
And now we turn to an open course from Fudan University Summer School of the Shanghai Institute of International Relations and Public Affairs. Now, in this lecture titled Why Wages Aren't Keeping Up with Inflation, leading scholars examine the economic forces behind rising living costs and the challenges workers face in maintaining their purchasing power. There's more coming up. Stay tuned.
The idea in the United States, or in my country, in the UK, that people start in one company at the age of 16 and leave that company at the age of 60, that era is finished. It's over. Before the mid-1980s, it's not that international capital and international finance were absent. They were, of course, present, but they were very much regulated and controlled, and their footprint across the globe was much smaller. So the real defining feature of of high globalization is this dominant role of international finance in the shaping of the world economy. It's not the only factor, though, that I think is important. That rise of finance, which itself is very concentrated, right? It's not, international finance is not dominated by small firms. It's dominated by big international players, the Goldman Sachs, the JP Morgans, the European financial institutions, Deutsche Bank and others. These are the big players in international finance. Of course, you have smaller players, like you have smaller actors in hedge funds and other institutions. Now you've got asset management companies, which are themselves very large, BlackRock and State Street, and these big players who have emerged over the last 20 years in international. These are big international bodies. They're not small players. And that's true, that has become true not only in the world of finance, but also in the world of business more generally. The global economy and international trade are dominated by very large multinational firms who dominate the particular markets in which they operate. That's true in telecommunications. You all know the nature of the big telecommunications companies. It's true with big agricultural companies. It's true of big pharmaceutical companies. It's true of big airline companies, airline producing companies, etc., who dominate their markets. Again, this is not necessarily a new feature of capitalism. It's been there before, but in the current era, the ability of a small number of firms to control markets is more intense than it's ever been. And there are very few new players in that world. We've seen new players emerge from South Korea in the last 25, 30 years, and we're beginning to see new players emerge from China too in the last 2 decades. But it's finance-dominated world. It's a highly concentrated corporate power world, and the relatively more open world than was true of the period immediately at the end of the Second World War. Liberalization has reduced barriers to entry across countries and markets in most parts of the world. Right? So most parts of the world are now more open to the movement of money, goods, and people and services than they were 30 or 40 years ago. So these are the big kind of features that are, in my opinion, dominating the system. We have other things. Technology has become part of this story, and the telecommunications and computer revolution have been part of this structuring of this hyper-globalized world, and clearly have been important. These are the forces shaping the world for the last 30 years. So the promise of these allowing these forces to dominate economies was rapidly rising incomes, rapid increases in productivity growth, rapid increases in investment, in productive investment. And that's not the story of the last 30 years. It's a much more uneven and unpredictable story than would be suggested if you believed that releasing these forces was simply going to produce very strongly positive outcomes. And I don't think it has. In the first place, growth which has been driven by private credit creation, right? So allowing finance to spread across the world has meant that debt and credit have become the driving forces of economic growth. And to some extent, what I would call rent-seeking behavior, this notion of cornering markets, essentially, have been the drivers of economic growth. This is different from the period at the end of the Second World War, or after the Second World War, when the real driving forces of economic growth were capital formation, investment in plant and equipment and people, real investment, not investment in financial assets. That's a very different thing. We live in a world in which most money flows into financial assets, not into capital formation. Rapid productivity growth was true of most of the 30 years at the end of the Second World War, and wages were rising very dramatically at the end of it. So you had these forces: investment, productivity, wages were what drove economic growth in the 3 decades from the end of the Second World War. That's not what's driving growth in most parts of the world today. There are exceptions to my story, and one of the exceptions is this country, obviously, where very high rates of investment, rising productivity, and rising wages are part of the growth story, obviously, of the East Asia region more generally, but China in particular. So in this world, in this world of dominant finance, concentrated markets, and relatively slow growth, rather than adding new wealth to the economic equation, what you're seeing is what some people talk about a winner-takes-all world. That is, the winners in this world are essentially extracting income from one part of the economy and monopolizing and controlling it in their own sphere of influence. And that, of course, is a recipe for growing economic inequality, which has been a dominant feature of the hyper-globalized world. Both income inequality and wealth inequality have risen dramatically over the course of the last 4 decades. So this is what I would call an age of extraction, and of course the environment. If you think people can be abused in this kind of way, it's not very difficult to think that the environment can also be abused in this kind of way as well. It's just there as something that to increase the portfolio value of firms and financial actors. That's clearly what has been happening in terms of the environment as well as in terms of the social structures. So this is a world of I see it then as a world of relatively slow growth outside some important pockets, and we have to talk about those. It's a world of precarious jobs. Precarity has been the idea in the United States, or in my country, in the UK, that people start in one company at the age of 16 and leave that company at the age of 60. That era is finished. It's over. People are unlikely to stay in the same job for more than 5 or 10 years in the same organization, if they're lucky to stay in that job. Many jobs have very few regulatory support. The so-called gig economy now accounts for a large part of the workforce in advanced economies. This is a much more precarious kind of working environment than was true of the one that was created in the 3 decades at the end of the Second World War. The social contract is disappearing in many countries. Some countries in Europe have managed to retain a social contract of sorts for medicine and education and other public goods, but in many other parts of the world that's fraying. And families are being squeezed. They feel they don't have the security, financial security. They don't have access to public goods in the way that they used to have access to public goods. And the inevitable consequence of that is a certain sense of anxiety and growing anxiety, which I think is a feature of many of the advanced economies. You compound that with technological uncertainties, the rise of AI, and the fear that jobs will not only be lost in the blue collar in factory work, but are now likely to be lost in the white collar service sector too. People are very anxious about these trends because they don't see the support that they feel their government should provide in the face of these overwhelming pressures.
And that brings us to the end of this week's edition of China Now with me, Makiza Latifa. We've taken you through the latest developments in China currents, shared expert analysis and top picks, and wrapped up with an insightful open course from Fudan University. Thank you so much for watching. My name remains Makiza Latifa. Please do remember to send in your comments, your thoughts, your feedback, and suggestions for the coming episodes of the show through the email provided below. Until next time, goodbye and enjoy the rest of our programs.